On a chilly evening in 2009, 257 passengers settle in for a long night ahead, a 14-hour flight to Dubai. As the plane taxied to the runway, no one knew the pilots had made a critical mistake only minutes earlier, which had doomed the flight. When the plane refused to fly after reaching the end of the runway, the pilots were faced with all or nothing. Stopping was not an option. This is the story of Emirates Flight 407. On the 20th of March 2009, Emirates Flight 407, an Airbus A340 took off from Auckland International Airport, bound for Melbourne, Australia, where it would make a short stop, change crews and continue on to Dubai. From humble beginnings with just 2 aircraft in the 1980s, Emirates now boasts one of the largest international fleets, serving more than 130 destinations with over 260 aircraft. And while the airline has some of the most luxurious cabins in the sky and a near-perfect safety record, on this day, one wrong digit would put all that in jeopardy. After an uneventful 3-hour hop from Auckland, Emirates Flight 407 touched down safely in Melbourne, Australia. Here, the crew from Auckland would get off, and the jet would be refueled and catered for its second leg to Dubai. The 14-hour flight, due to depart at 10:25 p.m, consisted of 2 pilots, 2 relief pilots and 14 cabin crew. As per Emirates procedure, all 4 pilots would be on the flight deck for takeoff and landing. Launched in 1993, the Airbus A340, featuring 4 engines, was designed for long-haul flights over large stretches of ocean. The theory was that 4 engines were better than 2 if one or more failed with nowhere to land. With the rising cost of oil in the 2000s, however, airlines shifted to their more fuel-efficient twin-engine counterparts, and the A340 never reached its full potential and mostly faded from the aviation landscape. Regardless, Emirates had 18 of them between 2003 and 2016. With both the captain and first officer, each with more than 8,000 flying hours, the crew for Emirates Flight EK407 to Dubai was, to say the least, highly experienced. At around 10 p.m, as passengers began boarding, up on the flight deck, the first officer entered the aircraft's weight into the electronic flight bag, or EFB, which was essentially an iPad. In return, the EFB would calculate the correct thrust and flap settings and the speed required to get airborne. The pilots would then enter these settings into the aircraft computer. To reduce wear and tear on the engines, therefore reducing the cost of maintenance, pilots use only as much thrust as needed for takeoff. This largely depends on the aircraft's weight and the runway's length. However, one very small mistake was about to endanger the lives of all those on board. The total weight of Emirates Flight 407, including cargo, 257 passengers, fuel and the aircraft, was calculated by the pilots at 361.9 tonnes. They added 1 additional tonne for last-minute changes, bringing the takeoff weight to 362.9 tonnes. However, when the first officer entered the takeoff weight into the electronic flight bag, essentially the iPad or small laptop, he made one tiny mistake. Instead of 362.9, he added 262.9 and failed to notice the blunder. Using the erroneous weight fed to it, the EFB generated the flap and thrust settings and the required speed to get airborne. He handed these figures to the captain to cross-check. It's here, likely distracted by others on the flight deck and speaking with air traffic control, the captain failed to notice the mistake. Under standard operating procedure, a verbal cross-check between the pilots was required, but for one reason or another, this did not happen. It was now that the situation turned from a simple transcription error that should have been easily picked up to a genuine threat to the lives of all on board. The captain, who had failed to notice the mistake, now entered the false takeoff calculations generated by the EFB into the aircraft computer. What this basically meant was the aircraft now believed it was a full 100 tons lighter than it was. and the engine thrust and flap settings for takeoff were now configured according to that error. With the first officer flying and the captain monitoring, Emirates Flight 407 lined up for takeoff. Once cleared for takeoff, the first officer pushed the engine throttles to the flex thrust position. This was not full power. As I mentioned earlier, to reduce wear and tear on the engines, only the minimum required thrust for a safe takeoff is used. However, as we already know, the calculations used were highly erroneous. As the jet ambled down the runway, the pilots probably should have noticed the reduced performance, but with the A340 having a somewhat sluggish reputation, this point went unnoticed. At a mere 3,400 feet from the end of the runway, reaching 146 knots, the speed calculated by the AFB for liftoff, the captain called to rotate. The first officer applied back pressure to his side stick to raise the nose of the aircraft. However, the plane did not respond. 2 seconds later, the captain again asked him to rotate. The FO pulled back further on his side stick and, although the nose began to rise, the plane still wouldn't fly, and the tail started scraping along the runway. Now, with only 187 feet from the end of the runway, the captain pushed the thrust levers to full power. This was a double-edged decision. On the one hand, additional power might get them airborne, or simply increase the speed at which they crashed. With the engines now at full power, the speed increased rapidly as the plane passed the end of the runway onto the sealed stopway and the grass beyond that, all while the tail scraped on the ground below. Towards the back of the plane, passengers were getting shaken up. Sparks from the underbelly being torn up beneath created an orange glow that filled the cabin. Finally, at a speed of 166 knots and 1.5 football fields past the end of the runway, the aircraft finally started to climb. However, the danger was far from over. At 1,100 feet beyond the end of the runway, the landing gear struck a 5-foot-high antenna, and at more than 1,600 feet past the end of the runway, they barely cleared a 7-foot fence. After climbing to 7,000 feet, they started circling out over the bay, while dumping fuel to reduce their weight so they could come in and land again. It's here that the first officer, after reviewing the EFB, finally realized his mistake. Although the pilots didn't yet know it, the contact with the runway on the rear sections of the fuselage had ripped off some of the outer skin of the aircraft as well as several service panels and left large scratch marks on the underside of the aircraft. Furthermore, contact with the landing gear had ripped out a localizer antenna beyond the end of the runway. At around 11:27 PM, while still offloading fuel, the pilots received reports from the cabin crew of smoke in the cabin. They contacted air traffic control and requested to land immediately. At 11:36 PM, 1 hour and 4 minutes after the ordeal started, Emirates Flight 407 touched down safely with no further incident, although for the pilots, their troubles were far from over. After completing their interviews with investigators, Emirates promptly summoned both pilots back to Dubai. Upon arrival, both captain and first officer were asked to resign from the airline, to which they both did. The investigation into the incident was conducted by the ATSB. Although several factors were identified, the ATSB determined there were 2 primary factors that caused the incident. The pilots failed to notice the erroneous takeoff weight used for the takeoff calculations, and they failed to detect the degraded takeoff performance until very late in the takeoff roll. The investigation also found that the flight crew failed to complete all their pre-flight checks in accordance with standard operating procedures, leading to them not detecting their error. Although the ATSB blamed the incident on human error, their report acknowledged that the quick actions of the captain when the aircraft went off the end of the runway likely prevented catastrophe. In the aftermath of the events, Emirates reviewed its pre-flight procedures, mandating the duplication of laptop computers used for pre-flight planning, and Airbus updated its software to detect such erroneous data. The aircraft involved in the incident was repaired and returned to service 9 months later. If you enjoyed today's video, I'd love it if you subscribed and joined me for the next one. To watch another of my aviation videos, you can click the link on screen. And as always, thanks for watching.